I've been spending wild nights with your business partner for months, Madison declared, her tone drenched in defiance. She leaned against the edge of Dylan's desk, her smirk challenging him to react. Dylan leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin, his expression unreadable. Go on, he said after a moment, his voice calm and deliberate. Spill your soul. Madison faltered for a brief second, her confident mask flickering. What kind of man are you? No shouting, no demands? You're just going to sit there? He smiled faintly, leaning forward now. What would shouting accomplish? I prefer solutions to theatrics. The casual dismissal stung. Madison straightened, folding her arms. Fine. If you're so unbothered, maybe you don't care at all. Dylan tilted his head, studying her like a chessboard he had already mastered. You think I didn't notice the late nights? The lies are not quite clever enough to weave properly? I knew months ago. The color drained from her face. You knew. Of course, he said with a faint shrug, his voice maddeningly calm. You see, while you were indulging your little escapade, I was working on something far more consequential. Madison's bravado faltered. What are you talking about? Dylan leaned back again, his smirk growing. Your lover, my so-called partner, has no idea I've been dismantling his empire piece by piece. As of this morning, it's all mine. Her jaw tightened. You're bluffing? He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder, flipping it open to reveal signed documents. Care to see for yourself? The buyouts, the stock transfers, all legal and final. Madison stared at the papers, her smirk on. How could you? Because unlike you, I understand leverage, he interrupted. His tone grew sharper, more pointed. And while we're on the topic of surprises, let me share another. Last night, I had dinner with your lover's wife. Charming woman, really. A refreshing change from the deceit I've grown accustomed to. Madison's breath hitched. You're lying? Why would I? Dylan countered, standing and buttoning his suit jacket with unhurried precision. She's as dissatisfied with her husband as I am with you. But unlike you, she carries herself with a certain grace. The words cut deeper than any yell could have. Madison's facade crumbled, replaced by raw confusion. You can't just do this. Dylan approached her slowly, his voice dropping into a steely calm. I already have. While you were playing games, I was making moves. And now, the game is over. She backed away, her confidence replaced by panic. You think you've won? That you'll just walk away unscathed? Dylan chuckled dryly. Madison, I'm not walking away. I'm leaving you behind. She grasped at her anger, desperate for control. You'll regret this. No, you will, Dylan replied, his tone final. He opened the office door, but paused to glance back at her. Enjoy your freedom, Madison. By the time you and your paramour realize the cost of your actions, you'll have nothing left. Not even each other. With that, he stepped out, leaving Madison alone in the office. Her bravado was gone, replaced by trembling hands and a racing mind. Dylan strode down the corridor with purpose, his mind already shifting gears. A text lit up his phone, a confirmation from his assistant about tonight's meeting. The company's future was in motion, and his personal life was a chapter he had just closed. In a parking garage, he stopped by his car, a sleek black sedan that mirrored his polished exterior. Before he could enter, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Grace, his business partner's wife. Dinner was lovely. Looking forward to our next conversation. Dylan allowed himself a rare, genuine smile. Onward, he muttered, stepping into his car and driving off into a future he intended to shape on his terms. 6 months earlier, Dylan had no reason to suspect anything was amiss. As the CEO of a thriving tech company, his days were long, but he always made time for his wife, Madison. They'd met in college, and their love story seemed destined for the storybooks. Or so he believed. It was a chance remark from an employee that first planted the seed of suspicion in Dylan's mind. Saw Mr. Carter at the club last night, the intern had said innocently during a meeting. Funny, he looked like he was with Mrs. Kingston. Dylan froze, his pen pausing mid-note. Excuse me? The intern's eyes widened, realizing his slip. Oh, I must have been mistaken. Forget I said anything. Dylan's expression didn't waver, but his mind churned. Noted, he said casually, then redirected the conversation back to the agenda. However, the comment stayed with him, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. One evening, as they sat in their cozy dining room, Madison twirled her fork absently in her pasta. You've been working too hard lately, she said, her tone casual but her eyes avoiding his. Why don't you take some time off? Let someone else handle things for a while. Dylan chuckled, reaching for her hand. I can't just step away. Besides, I'm building this for us, for our future. She smiled faintly, but her eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite place. He decided not to press her. Everyone had their moments of introspection, he reasoned. She was likely just tired. As the weeks went by, small changes began to surface. Madison started spending more evenings out, citing book club meetings or yoga sessions. Her phone buzzed more often, and she was quick to shield the screen. Dylan's instincts, honed through years of negotiating high-stakes deals, whispered that something wasn't right. Still, he pushed the thoughts aside. Trust was the cornerstone of their marriage. One Friday evening, Dylan returned home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. "Madison," he called out, loosening his tie as he walked toward the kitchen. A half-empty glass of wine sat on the counter, but there was no sign of her. Checking his phone, he saw a text. "Out with the girls. Don't wait up." He sighed, pouring himself a glass of the same wine. The thought of her out enjoying herself while he drowned in work stung slightly, but he dismissed it. She deserved her space. They both did. The following week, during a routine meeting with his business partner, Paul, Dylan noticed a peculiar shift in tone. Paul, usually brash and overly confident, seemed unusually distracted. "You okay?" Dylan asked, watching as Paul fumbled with his pen. "Yeah, just too much on my plate lately," Paul replied, forcing a grin. Dylan nodded, unconvinced but unwilling to pry. "Well, let me know if there's anything I can do to help lighten the load." Paul's laugh was forced. "Appreciate it. I'll manage." It wasn't until a month later that the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. Dylan was preparing for a critical investor presentation when his assistant, Rachel, knocked on his office door. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, hesitating, "but I thought you should see this." She handed him a plain manila envelope. Inside were photographs. Dylan's stomach twisted as he flipped through them. Madison and Paul, laughing over dinner at an upscale restaurant. Madison's hand resting on Paul's arm as they walked down a dimly lit street. A kiss, unmistakable and damning. "Where did you get these?" Dylan's voice was calm, but his grip on the photos tightened. "Anonymous delivery this morning," Rachel said softly. "I'm sorry, Dylan." Dylan's mind raced. His first instinct was rage, but he knew better than to act impulsively. Years of navigating corporate betrayals had taught him the value of patience. "Thank you, Rachel. Please keep this between us," he said, slipping the photos back into the envelope. That evening, he returned home to find Madison already in bed, pretending to read a novel. He leaned against the doorway, watching her. "How was yoga?" he asked casually. She glanced up, startled. "Good. Relaxing. You should try it sometime." "Maybe I will," he replied, smiling faintly. "Good night, Madison." "Good night, Dylan," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes darting back to the book too quickly. The next morning, Dylan began his counter-strategy. He met with his legal team, discreetly initiating the process of buying out Paul's shares in the company. Piece by piece, he secured control, ensuring Paul remained unaware of the shifts until it was too late. Dylan sat alone in his office, the glow of the computer screen reflecting off his glasses. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, typing and deleting with precision. Each move he made was part of a bigger plan, a quiet but effective war against Carter's empire. Weeks of research, meetings, and quiet acquisitions had led him here. It was all falling into place. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms above his head. The cold, sterile office felt far more familiar than it had a few months ago. The constant click of his pen, tapping against the desk, was the only sound in the room. His thoughts churned, analyzing the next steps. There was still a lot to do, but he was close, so close. But then there was Grace. Dylan had never anticipated that he would need an ally inside Carter's circle, but fate had a way of presenting opportunities when least expected. Their first meeting had been tense, uncomfortable. Grace had sat across from him in the dimly lit restaurant, her arms crossed, eyes sharp with suspicion. "Why should I help you?" she had asked, her voice cold but controlled. Dylan met her gaze. There was no sign of hesitation, no sign of fear. He had learned long ago that control was everything. "Because he's been lying to both of us," he said simply. "And I think you deserve better." She had studied him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. Dylan could see the gears turning in her head, the hesitation mixed with something else, anger, maybe even betrayal. Grace had spent years in Carter's shadow, and yet she was still his wife, the one person who might be able to bring him down from within. Finally, she had nodded. "You think I can just help you take him down? You're playing a dangerous game." Dylan hadn't responded immediately. Instead, he took a long drink from his glass, the ice clinking softly as it settled in the empty space between them. I'm not asking you to be part of my plan. I'm asking you to be part of your own future. Her lips had thinned, and for a moment, Dylan thought she might walk out. Instead, she'd taken a deep breath. I don't trust you. I don't expect you to, Dylan had replied. But I trust you know the truth. You've seen the cracks in Carter's facade. You've felt the lies. Grace had exhaled sharply, her posture slumping for a brief moment. The battle within her was evident. In the end, it was her anger that won. Anger at Carter, at the lies, at the years wasted. Fine, but we do this my way. I'm not a pawn. Dylan nodded. Deal? At the same time, Dylan began subtly observing Madison. He didn't confront her, instead choosing to note her patterns. He discovered her favorite meeting spots, her newly purchased wardrobe items, and the subtle ways she altered her schedule to accommodate her affair. One evening, while Madison was out again, Dylan received a call from Grace, Paul's wife. Dylan, I think we need to talk, she said, her voice trembling. I'm listening, Dylan replied, his tone even. It's about Paul and Madison, she said. I've known for a while now. I didn't know how to bring it up. I told you already. Thank you for telling me, Dylan said after a pause. Perhaps we can help each other, as we promised. Over the next few weeks, Dylan and Grace shared information, carefully plotting their next moves. Grace revealed that Paul had been using company funds to finance his outings with Madison, a revelation that gave Dylan even more leverage. Dylan arrived home earlier than usual. Madison was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with practiced ease. You're home early, she remarked without looking up. Had an efficient day, Dylan replied, leaning against the counter. He studied her movements, looking for signs he couldn't yet name. How about you? How was your day? The usual. Yoga, a bit of shopping, catching up with some friends. Her tone was light, but she avoided his eyes. Anyone I know? He asked, his voice deceptively casual. No, just the girls from class, she said quickly, moving to the sink. Dylan didn't press further, but the unease settled deeper. Later that night, as Madison's breathing grew steady in sleep, Dylan lay awake, replaying the intern's comment. He decided it was time to observe more closely. The next week, he started noticing patterns. Madison's phone buzzed more often, and she always checked it with a furtive glance. Her outings grew more frequent, her explanations vaguer. Dylan kept his observations to himself, acting as though nothing was amiss. One night, while Madison was out, Dylan sat in his office, staring at her recent credit card statements. Charges for expensive dinners, boutique hotels, and a membership to an exclusive club, none of which aligned with the stories she told him. He cross-referenced the club's events and found Carter's name listed as a frequent attendee. The realization hit him like a cold wave. Madison was having an affair with his business partner, Carter. For a moment, the betrayal threatened to overwhelm him. But Dylan's years in the corporate world had taught him one thing. Emotions could wait. Strategy couldn't. He decided not to confront her immediately. Instead, he began to gather evidence. Late one night, he accessed their shared phone account, pulling up call logs and text messages. The exchanges between Madison and Carter were damning. Flirtatious banter, veiled plans, even photos, all confirming what he already suspected. The next day, Dylan called his assistant Rachel into his office. I need you to do something discreet, he began. Rachel nodded, her professionalism unwavering. Of course. What do you need? Track Carter's business dealings over the past 6 months. Specifically, anything that might look questionable. Rachel didn't ask for details. I'll get started right away. As Rachel worked behind the scenes, Dylan began subtly testing Carter. During meetings, he dropped hints, mentioning club events or dinners Madison had claimed to attend. Carter's reactions were telling, a slight hesitation, a flicker of unease. One evening, Dylan invited Carter and his wife, Grace, to dinner at his home. Madison's surprise was evident when he told her. I thought it would be nice to catch up, Dylan said, his tone neutral. We've been so busy lately. The dinner was a delicate dance. Dylan watched as Carter and Madison exchanged subtle glances, their body language betraying their secret. Meanwhile, Grace seemed blissfully unaware, laughing at Dylan's anecdotes and complimenting Madison's cooking. After dessert, as the women chatted in the living room, Dylan poured Carter a drink. So, he began, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. What's been keeping you so busy these days? Carter shifted in his seat. Oh, just the usual. Expanding the client base, attending networking events. Dylan nodded slowly. Madison mentioned you've been spending a lot of time at the club. Must be a great place for networking. Carter's grip on his glass tightened. Yeah, it's been useful. I'll have to join you sometime, Dylan said, his smile not reaching his eyes. Maybe next week? Carter's response was a muttered, sure, anytime. By the time the evening ended, Dylan was certain. The tension between Carter and Madison was palpable, their attempts to mask it only making it more obvious. The following week, Rachel returned with her findings. Carter's been embezzling funds, she reported. Not a lot at once, but over time it's added up. I've got the records to prove it. Dylan's lips curved into a cold smile. Perfect. Keep this under wraps for now. I'll decide the right moment to use it. That evening, as Madison prepared for another yoga class, Dylan approached her. Have fun tonight, he said, kissing her cheek. She hesitated, as if sensing something different in his tone, but she simply smiled and left. Dylan watched her go, his resolve solidifying. If they wanted to betray him, he'd ensure it cost them everything. The discovery had set the wheels in motion, and Dylan was ready to play the long game. The next few weeks had been a whirlwind of strategy and manipulation. Grace provided valuable insight into Carter's operations. She knew the hidden details, the little things Carter had kept from his partners. Those were the details Dylan needed. He'd already begun the process of acquiring shares, slowly buying out Carter's stockholders without attracting too much attention. Each acquisition brought him closer to his goal, but every step forward was still dangerous. Dylan worked in silence most of the time. He didn't need to explain his moves to anyone. His team understood the stakes, and their loyalty was unquestioned. Every morning, he received reports on the latest shifts in the stock market and Carter's business dealings. Every night, he planned his next move, analyzing each acquisition with meticulous detail. Then there were the conversations with Grace. One evening, they met at a cafe just outside of the city, away from prying eyes. She had insisted on meeting in person, a decision Dylan respected. He had learned long ago not to underestimate the value of face-to-face interactions. I spoke with him, Grace said, her eyes scanning the room cautiously. Carter's suspicious. He started to notice things, asking questions. Dylan didn't react immediately. What kind of questions? He's asking about the company's financials, looking at the acquisitions, trying to figure out who's behind the sudden changes. That's good, Dylan said, leaning forward slightly. It means he's aware, but it also means we need to move faster. Grace's fingers drummed against the edge of her coffee cup. He's not going to give up without a fight. I can't keep him in the dark forever. Dylan thought for a moment. I know, but I don't need him to be in the dark. I need him to believe that he still has control. Grace raised an eyebrow. And how do we do that? I'll need you to start creating doubt. Make him think his own decisions are under scrutiny. Plant seeds of mistrust within his inner circle. Let him start second-guessing every move. Grace's lips curled into a slight smile, but it wasn't a friendly one. I can do that. Dylan leaned back, studying her. She had changed since their first meeting. Her resolve was stronger, her confidence sharper. This wasn't the same woman who had sat across from him, unsure and guarded. This was someone who had embraced the reality of her situation, someone who had chosen a side. The next step is crucial, Dylan continued. I'm going to make another acquisition tomorrow. A small one, but it'll send the right message. We need to start forcing Carter's hand. The following day, Dylan sat in his office, watching the ticker on his screen. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the desk, and he waited. The buy order had gone through, and the market had reacted as expected. Carter's empire was shrinking piece by piece. The phone rang. Dylan glanced at the display and saw Grace's name. He picked it up quickly. It's done, she said, her voice tight. I did what you asked. He started to question everything. Good, Dylan replied. We're almost there. Just a few more moves, and we'll have him cornered. There was a brief silence on the other end. And then, Dylan said, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, we let him implode on his own. As the weeks wore on, Dylan's strategy began to bear fruit. Carter's empire was crumbling under the pressure of internal strife, bad investments, and the slow, methodical dismantling Dylan had orchestrated. But it wasn't just the business side that was unraveling. There was something deeper at work. The tension between Carter and his inner circle had reached a boiling point. People who had once been loyal to him were starting to question his leadership. And that's when the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Dylan had arranged a meeting with Carter. He had carefully crafted the setting, a neutral location, a place where no one could eavesdrop. It would be a simple conversation, one that would set the stage for Carter's downfall. When Carter entered the room, Dylan greeted him with a nod, a cold, professional expression on his face. You've been busy, Carter said, his tone clipped. I see your little acquisitions are starting to add up. Dylan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Carter, watching the anger simmer just beneath the surface. This was a man on the edge, a man who could either fold or explode. You're losing control, Dylan finally said. Carter's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. You thought you could keep this empire running forever, Dylan continued, his voice calm, almost soothing. But every empire falls. And yours is about to collapse? Carter stood there, fists clenched at his sides. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out. But instead, he just stared at Dylan, a mixture of fury and disbelief in his eyes. And that's when Dylan knew. He had won. The plan was complete. The end was inevitable now. The cold morning light filtered into Dylan's office as he sat at the head of the long conference table. The folder in front of him was thick with evidence. Contracts, financial statements, emails, and recorded conversations. It had taken weeks to compile everything, but it was now all here, undeniable proof of Carter's corruption, deception, and criminal activity. Dylan's fingers hovered over the folder for a moment before he closed it, his mind focused. Today was the day. He had invited both Madison and Carter to a meeting under the pretense of discussing a potential deal, something big. The tension was already palpable as he thought about what was to come. He could already picture their faces, the confusion, the anger, and finally the realization. It would be a reckoning. For them, for Carter, for everyone involved. The door to the conference room opened with a soft click, and Madison entered first, looking her usual composed self. But as soon as she saw Dylan sitting alone at the table, the smile on her face faltered. Her eyes flickered briefly to the folder in front of him, then to his face. She hesitated, then took a seat across from him, hands neatly folded in her lap. Dylan, she said softly, trying to sound casual. What's this about? You said it was urgent. Dylan didn't respond right away, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched her. She had been so sure of herself, so confident in their relationship, in their ability to outmaneuver everyone. But now, there was something in her posture that was different, a nervous energy that wasn't there before. The door opened again, and Carter strode in, his presence commanding, his eyes immediately locking onto Dylan. The older man didn't sit. Instead, he stood near the doorway, scanning the room with suspicion. Dylan could see the tension in Carter's shoulders, his body rigid with a mix of impatience and hostility. This wasn't how he expected things to go. You wanted to see me? Carter's voice was sharp, demanding. Where's the deal? Dylan didn't flinch. He simply gestured to the table. Take a seat. We have more important matters to discuss. Carter's eyes flicked to Madison, who had already sat down and looked uncharacteristically uneasy. He scowled but took a seat next to her, not taking his eyes off Dylan. Dylan's hand slowly slid the folder across the table, the sound of paper against wood the only noise breaking the tense silence. Carter's fingers grabbed the folder, and without hesitation, he flipped it open, scanning the contents quickly. His face twisted in disbelief, then fury, as he began to read through the documents. His breath quickened, and his eyes darted between the pages, his lips moving soundlessly as he processed the information. Dylan didn't say anything. He let Carter's anger build. Finally, Carter slammed the folder down on the table, his face turning crimson. You can't do this, he roared. You think you can just walk in here and take everything from me? You think this is how it ends? You're a fool, Dylan. A damn fool. Dylan didn't react to Carter's outburst. His expression remained calm, almost bored. Oh, I can and I have, he replied evenly. Your company is mine now. Your assets are frozen. You're done. This has been coming for a long time. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Carter's fury intensified, and he stood up, knocking the chair back with a loud crash. You can't, this isn't over. I'll fight you in court. I'll fight you until the end. Dylan slowly stood, walking around the table to face him directly. You had your chance. You made your moves, and now it's my turn. Madison's eyes were wide, her face pale as she watched the exchange. She glanced from Carter to Dylan, trying to process what was happening. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Dylan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Please, what's happening? What is all of this? Dylan's eyes shifted to her, his gaze cold, unfeeling. You know exactly what's happening, Madison. This has been going on for months. You knew about the deals, the lies, the manipulation. You knew about Carter's shady business practices. And yet, you chose to ignore it, to be a part of it. Madison's breath hitched, her eyes welling up with tears. Please, Dylan, she said, her voice trembling. I made a mistake. I didn't know how far it had gone. I didn't realize. Dylan held up a hand, silencing her. No, Madison. You didn't realize because you didn't want to. You wanted to live in your perfect little world where everything was just fine, where you didn't have to face the truth. But now it's too late. Madison's face crumpled, and she began to sob. I love you, Dylan, she cried, her voice breaking. Please, we can fix this. We can make it right. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't do this. Dylan's gaze was unwavering, his words sharp as knives. Fix this? You broke it, Madison. You broke everything. You betrayed me. You betrayed us. And now, you'll live with the consequences. She shook her head, desperate, her sobs growing louder. No, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I thought we were building something. I thought you and we had something real. Dylan's jaw tightened. It was never real, Madison. You were always Carter's pawn, and I was just a distraction. This was never about us. This was always about power. The tears didn't stop, and Madison covered her face with her hands, her body trembling. Carter, who had been seething, finally turned to her. You think this is the time for crying? He spat. You think you can just cry your way out of this? But Madison didn't hear him. She was beyond words now, completely broken by the weight of everything that had come crashing down. Dylan took a step back, crossing his arms over his chest. You've had your chance, Madison, but I'm done. You and Carter are finished. I'm taking control now. He turned to Carter, who was still pacing, his hands clenched into fists. You're going to watch your empire crumble, Carter. And when it does, you'll have no one to blame but yourself. It's over. Carter's eyes blazed with fury, but beneath the rage, there was a flicker of fear. For the first time in their years of business dealings, Dylan could see the uncertainty in Carter's eyes. The man who had once thought he could control everything was now realizing that he had lost everything. What are you going to do, Dylan? Carter spat. You think you can just take everything from me and walk away? Dylan's lips curled into a thin smile. I already have. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of those words sinking in. Madison's sobs were the only sound breaking the stillness. Dylan turned and walked toward the door. I'll leave you both to figure out what's left of your lives, he said coldly, his voice final. This chapter is over. As he left the room, he didn't look back. There was no satisfaction in the moment, no victory dance. The plan had been executed, and the fallout had begun. It was done. The weeks following the collapse of Carter and Madison's world were turbulent. News outlets reported on the scandals that had finally come to light, tearing apart the facade they had spent years building. Their empire, which once seemed so untouchable, had crumbled into ruin. Financial ruin, legal battles, and broken relationships followed in the wake of Dylan's calculated moves. Madison spent most of her days behind closed doors. The quiet hum of her apartment was filled with the constant buzz of her phone, filled with calls from lawyers, business contacts, and old friends who now avoided her. Her life had become a blur of meetings, press conferences, and public apologies that fell on deaf ears. She had lost everything: her status, her wealth, and most painfully Dylan. Carter, too, found himself in free fall. The board members who had once blindly followed him turned against him, and his businesses were slowly being picked apart. The harsh truth that he had spent years building on lies and manipulation was now a heavy burden. The walls of his mansion, once symbols of success, now seemed like reminders of all that he had lost. Meanwhile, Dylan found solace in the slow rebuild of his own life. In the days that followed the final blow to Carter's empire, he threw himself into his work, overseeing the acquisitions and strategic investments that would solidify his position. But as busy as he was with the business side of things, he found himself enjoying the calm that came from being with Grace. The bond between them had grown unexpectedly strong. Grace was not only a valuable ally in business, but also someone who seemed to understand Dylan on a deeper level. They shared long hours together, both discussing the future of Dylan's new ventures and simply enjoying the quiet moments of companionship. It was a kind of peace Dylan had never known before. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Dylan and Grace sat on the balcony of his apartment, each with a glass of wine in hand. The city below them hummed with life, but up here, the world felt distant, almost forgotten. They were alone together, and for a moment, Dylan allowed himself to relax. Grace turned her head to look at him, her gaze thoughtful. Do you ever regret it? How it all played out? Dylan took a slow sip from his glass, his eyes still focused on the skyline. He was quiet for a moment, the question weighing on him more than he expected. He had thought about the past, about what it had cost him and those around him. But the truth was he didn't regret it, not really. No, he said finally, his voice steady. Sometimes, to build something new, you have to tear down what was broken. Grace nodded, her expression unreadable. She didn't ask him to explain further. She understood, just as he understood her. They both had their own reasons for what they'd done, their own motivations that led them to this point. Neither of them were naive enough to believe there were no consequences. But both of them knew that what had come before couldn't be undone. You've done what needed to be done, Grace said, her voice softer now. But do you ever think about what it cost? Dylan turned to her then, studying her face. He had learned not to take her words lightly. She wasn't just a business partner anymore. She had become someone who saw through his carefully crafted walls. Of course, I think about it, he replied, his gaze shifting back to the sunset. But there are always costs. Nothing worth having comes without sacrifice. And the things I've gained, my peace, my freedom, those are worth it. She was quiet for a while, her gaze drifting back to the horizon. The wind tugged at her hair, and the sound of distant city life reached them, but it felt far away. In this moment, there was only the two of them and the weight of their shared silence. Dylan turned to face her fully. What about you? He asked. Do you ever think about your own choices? Grace's lips parted slightly, but she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she set her glass down on the table next to her and crossed her arms, staring at the sky. Dylan could tell she was processing her own thoughts. It's hard to avoid thinking about it, she said finally. I was married to a man who I thought I knew. And now, I have to live with the fact that I didn't know him at all. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. It's strange, you know? After everything we've been through, it's hard to believe it was all just a game for him. For Carter, it was always about power and control. It was never about us. Dylan reached out, gently placing a hand on hers. I know. And you were caught in it just like I was, but you got out. Grace's eyes softened, but there was still a hardness in them. It doesn't feel like I got out. It feels like I'm still trying to figure out who I am now. After everything, I still don't know what comes next. Dylan nodded, understanding. He had been through similar doubts. Even after everything he'd done, there were moments when he questioned his own path, his choices, and whether it was all worth it. But you're not alone anymore, he said quietly, looking her directly in the eyes. And neither am I. We're building something now. Together. Grace's expression softened at his words, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a small smile. There was still uncertainty ahead, but in this moment, they both understood what they had, what they were becoming. Together, they could face whatever came next. The sun dipped lower, the colors in the sky changing, and they both watched in silence, savoring the peace that had come from their shared journey. It wasn't the life either of them had expected, but it was theirs to shape. Dylan didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could handle it. Grace reached over and took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. We'll make it work, she said softly, her voice steady. Dylan nodded. Yeah, we will. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. They would face it together. And for Dylan, that was enough. Months had passed since the collapse of Carter's empire. Dylan had settled into his new life, the weight of the past now a distant memory. His days were filled with business deals, expanding his portfolio, and spending time with Grace. He had learned to find peace in his new reality, building something that was his own from the ashes of the chaos that had once consumed him. It was during one of those rare, quiet moments, late on a Sunday afternoon, when Dylan first noticed the envelope sitting on his desk. It was simple, unmarked, no return address, and it caught his attention because it seemed out of place. There were no regular business letters or contracts for him to review at this hour. He reached for it, intrigued. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar. It took a second for him to place it. Madison. For a moment, Dylan just stared at the letter, the familiar feelings of frustration and betrayal creeping back to the surface. He had not heard from her since the fallout, and he had assumed that she had disappeared into obscurity, hiding from the consequences of her actions. She had gotten what she deserved, what they both had. But now here she was reaching out. Slowly, he opened the envelope and unfolded the paper inside. The words seemed like they came from someone else, someone different than the Madison he remembered. Dylan, I'm sorry. For everything. I've lost everything, and I know it's my fault. But I need you to know. Carter betrayed me too. He's left me with nothing. I never realized what I had until it was gone. Please, if there's any part of you that still cares, help me. Dylan read the letter twice, then set it down on the table in front of him. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. There was a certain irony in the timing and in the words themselves. Madison, once so sure of her position, now reduced to pleading for help. Dylan leaned back in his chair, considering the letter. He had moved on. He had rebuilt, forged new relationships, and found a kind of peace he had never thought possible. But Madison's words lingered in his mind. I never realized what I had until it was gone. The phrase echoed through his thoughts, sharp and cutting. She had only truly understood the consequences of her actions when it was too late, just as he had once learned. A knock at the door broke his reverie. "Come in," Dylan called out. Grace stepped into the room, her presence filling the doorway. She paused when she saw the letter on the desk, then looked back at him. "Is everything okay?" Dylan didn't immediately answer, his fingers tracing the edge of the envelope. He debated whether or not to tell her about the letter. But Grace had become his closest ally in all things, business, personal, everything. She could read him like no one else. "It's from Madison," Dylan said finally, lifting the letter slightly for her to see. "She's asking for help." Grace frowned, stepping further into the room. "Help? After everything?" Dylan chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "Yeah, she claims Carter betrayed her, that she lost everything." "Typical," Grace replied with a hint of bitterness. "It's all about damage control for her. She wants to play the victim now that Carter's done with her." Dylan didn't respond immediately. He was still processing the letter, still deciding what to do. Madison's plea seemed so genuine, and yet so familiar. She had always been manipulative, always looking for a way to turn the tables when things didn't go her way. Was this another attempt at manipulation? Or was she truly in need? Grace seemed to read his hesitation. "Are you seriously considering helping her?" Dylan stood and paced across the room. He could feel Grace's eyes on him, waiting for an answer, but he needed time to think. His relationship with Madison had been built on lies, and trust had been destroyed the moment she sided with Carter. Yet there was something in the letter that made him question everything. "I don't know," Dylan said, his voice low. "I've moved on. I've let go of everything that happened, but I guess part of me still wonders if there's any truth to what she's saying." Grace's expression softened, but her tone remained firm. "Dylan, you've already lost so much because of her. Why risk going back? She's only reaching out because she's desperate." "I know," Dylan said, turning to face her. I don't know if I can ignore it. I feel like there's something else going on. She says Carter betrayed her too. He left her with nothing. Maybe it's true. Maybe it's not." Grace sighed, crossing her arms. "You can't fix people, Dylan. Not her. Not Carter. You've already made your choice. You've already moved on. Don't let her pull you back into that mess." Dylan ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. He wanted to believe Grace, to trust his instincts and ignore the past. But a small part of him couldn't let go of the idea that Madison was reaching out, not just out of desperation, but because she genuinely needed help. "Maybe I just want closure," he muttered, more to himself than to Grace. Grace stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then you can have closure. You don't need to go back to her. You've already closed that chapter. Don't open it again." Dylan looked down at the letter, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had been trying to close the door on his past, to leave behind everything that had dragged him into that toxic world. He couldn't allow Madison or Carter or anyone else to drag him back into that fight. But something in him couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to her words than he wanted to admit. Later that evening, as the city lights twinkled below, Dylan sat alone in his office, the letter still in front of him. His thoughts swirled, each one pulling him in a different direction. He was proud of the life he had rebuilt, of the person he had become. But he couldn't ignore the voice inside his head, the voice that wondered if this was the final piece of his past that needed to be dealt with. As he stood and walked toward the door, he knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to get sucked back into Madison's world, but he would find out the truth. He couldn't help himself. He had to know if her betrayal was real, if Carter had truly abandoned her, or if this was just another manipulation. He would go to her. He would see her one last time, but this time, it would be on his terms. With a final glance at the letter, Dylan tossed it into the trash can. He had already made his decision. The past would stay buried, but it seemed like it would always find a way to rise again. Dylan stood at the window of his office, overlooking the city that now felt like his own. The skyline stretched out before him, a symbol of all the work he had put in over the past few months. He had rebuilt everything: his career, his sense of self, his relationships. And now, as he surveyed the city, it felt like he had finally gained control of his life. There were no more strings pulling him back into a past filled with deception and pain. No more unresolved issues gnawing at him. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. Dylan glanced down and saw Grace's name on the screen. He smiled briefly before answering. "Hey, Grace." "Hey," she replied. "I just wanted to check in. You still coming over for dinner tonight?" "Of course," Dylan said. "I'll be there around 7. He hung up, feeling a sense of contentment settle over him. Life was simple now. He had moved on from everything except the lessons that had shaped him into who he was today. His relationship with Grace was steady, built on trust, mutual respect, and understanding. He no longer had to carry the weight of past mistakes or regrets. He had learned to let go. Later that evening, Dylan arrived at Grace's apartment. She greeted him with a warm smile as she opened the door. "You're right on time," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Dylan walked into the cozy apartment, the familiar scent of fresh herbs and cooking filling the air. Grace had always been a good cook, and tonight was no exception. "How's your day been?" she asked as they moved toward the kitchen. "It's been good," Dylan replied, setting his briefcase down. "Busy but good. The new acquisition is looking promising. It's all coming together." "That's great," Grace said with a smile. "You deserve it. Everything you've worked for is finally falling into place." Dylan nodded, taking a seat at the kitchen counter. "It's been a long road, but yeah, I'm happy with where things are." As Grace finished preparing dinner, they chatted about the events of the day. There was no mention of Madison or Carter. That part of his life had been put to rest months ago, and he had no intention of reopening old wounds. When dinner was ready, Grace set the table, and they sat down to eat. The conversation flowed easily, and Dylan felt a rare sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the weight of his past hovering over him. It was just the two of them, enjoying the present with no distractions. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Madison sat alone in her apartment. The weight of her decisions hung over her like a dark cloud. She had reached out to Dylan in a last-ditch attempt to salvage something, anything, from the wreckage of her life. But her plea had fallen on deaf ears. Dylan hadn't responded, and it was clear to her now that he had moved on. Her phone buzzed with a notification, a news alert. Madison picked it up and read the headline. "Carter's empire collapses. Scandal and betrayal lead to major losses." She stared at the screen for a moment before throwing the phone onto the couch, feeling a rush of frustration. She had once believed that her connection with Carter was unbreakable, but now she saw the truth. Carter had betrayed her, just as he had betrayed everyone else. He had used her, manipulated her, and when it was no longer convenient, he had left her behind. She was alone now, a cautionary tale of misplaced trust and ambition. The life she had built with Carter had been an illusion, and now she was left with nothing. Back at Grace's apartment, Dylan and Grace finished their meal and moved to the living room. Dylan stretched out on the couch, his body relaxing into the cushions. Grace joined him, curling up beside him. "So, what's next for us?" Grace asked, her voice low and steady. Dylan turned to look at her, a smile tugging at his lips. "What do you mean?" "You've rebuilt your career," she said, her fingers tracing the outline of his hand. "You've rebuilt your life. But what about us? What's next for us?" Dylan paused, considering the question. They had been together for months now, and the bond between them had only grown stronger with time. But he hadn't really thought about the future beyond the immediate. He had been so focused on the work ahead of him that he hadn't fully considered where their relationship might go. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I guess I've just been taking it one day at a time." "That's okay," Grace said with a small laugh. "I'm in no rush. I just wanted to know what you were thinking." Dylan took a deep breath, his gaze softening. "I'm thinking that this," he gestured between the two of them. "This feels right. And for once, I'm not afraid of where it might go." Grace smiled, her eyes meeting his. "Good, because I feel the same way." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their unspoken understanding filling the space between them. The future was uncertain, but in this moment, that didn't matter. They had both learned to live in the present, appreciating the quiet moments and the simple joys. The next day, Dylan received a call from his lawyer. As he listened to the details of the conversation, a sense of finality washed over him. The last remnants of Carter's influence had been wiped away. The business empire that Carter had spent years building had completely disintegrated. Dylan had taken control of what was left, transforming it into something new, something his own. As the call ended, Dylan leaned back in his chair, a smile on his lips. He had won, not just in business, but in life. He had faced the chaos, the betrayals, and the setbacks, and he had come out the other side stronger, more determined than ever. There was no more room for people like Carter or Madison in his world. They were part of a past that no longer had any hold over him. He stood up from his desk and walked to the window, looking out over the city once more. The skyline was still the same, but to him, it felt different now. He was in control, and for the first time in a long time, Dylan was content with where he was. In the end, the fallout from his past had shaped him, but it would no longer define him. He had built something new, and now he was free to enjoy it. The future was his, and he was ready for whatever came next. As he turned away from the window, he thought about Grace, about the life they were building together. They had both come from different worlds, but together, they were creating something that was theirs, something that would last. Dylan picked up his phone and sent her a message. "Can't wait to see you tonight." And for the first time in a long time, he felt sure of one thing: he was exactly where he needed to be.